Thirdly, when God finally gets them to Mount Sinai, Exodus 19, he articulates to them the covenant. And here's the words he starts with. He says to the people of Israel, through Moses, "If you obey my laws, then you will be my people." This is interesting, because that means that what God is offering them is a conditional covenant. An if-then. As soon as you hear if-then in a covenant, you know there's a condition to it. Now, when God speaks to Noah about the covenant of never flooding the earth again, of always keeping the cycles of nature regular and dependable, there's no if-then. It's an unconditional promise. When God gives his promise in the next covenant to Abraham, it's simply, "I will give you descendants and land. I will make your name great. I will give you rest and protection." No if-then. It's an unconditional covenant. So it's interesting that in this fourth covenant, we see God put the covenant in an if-then formula. Conditional. If you keep my law, then you'll be my people. The unspoken alternative condition is, if you do not keep my law, you will not be my people. This is a really interesting reframe for this particular covenant. Now, what this harkens back to is the creation covenant, because the creation covenant too was also conditional. If you eat of the tree, then you surely shall die. Another if-then clause, conditional covenant. Here's the question. Why does God offer Israel a conditional covenant when the prior two covenants, Noah's and Abraham's, were unconditional? Why does God move to conditionality here? And I think what we can see is God's just being a wise covenant maker here. God is always a wise covenant maker. He knows how covenant works. He understands his partner that he's going into this covenant with, and he designs the covenant for this particular relationship. Now, here's the challenge. God has just seen that he cannot trust this people. He saw a 3-month journey where every time he gave them the opportunity to trust him, they refused. So what do you do if you are God and you're going to enter into a covenant with people you know don't trust you, and therefore you cannot trust? What do you do? The answer is, you enter into a conditional covenant. That's just wise. If you have to be in covenant with someone you don't trust, there have to be conditions around that, just for wisdom's sake. Now, one might ask the question, wait a minute, why would you make a covenant at all with someone you don't trust? Here's why. God's in a double bind here. On one hand, he's unconditionally promised Abraham that this will be his people, Abraham's descendants. So he's bound himself unconditionally to work with this people. He has to be in covenant with these people. But he does have flexibility on how he's in covenant with these people. And knowing that he can't trust their hearts, at least not this generation of Abraham's children, he enters into a conditional covenant so that he has flexibility to work with them until he can find a faithful descendant of Abraham. This is really taking us through the history now of the scriptural narrative as we begin to see God working through history with Abraham's children, all stemming back to that unconditional promise to Abraham. So God enters into a conditional covenant with an unfaithful people because God is being faithful to Abraham's promise of the unconditionality of working with his children. This leads now, fourthly, to the law. In Exodus 24, the final moment has come where the ceremony happens. Interesting ceremony. Take a moment sometime to read Exodus 24 and see the covenant ceremony that God enacts with his people. There's the blood. Now, when you're covenanting with, 1 million people, or the large number that was with Israel at that point, you can't do a normal walk through the pieces of the animals with 1 million people. So what they sort of do an alternative to that particular ceremony. It says there's basins of blood from the sacrificial animals, and part of it, half of the blood is poured on the altar. The other half is sprinkled over the people. So still there's a blood ceremony with two parts, almost like the two parts of the animal. And then it comes to the point in the ceremony where Moses speaks the terms of the covenant, right? Almost like if you were at a wedding ceremony, it'd come to the moment where the couples exchange their vows, the terms of the covenant. And when Moses starts to read the terms of the covenant, it's a lengthy, lengthy process. Moses lays out the terms of Sinai, the law of Sinai. Now, I wonder, what's your reaction when you hear the word, the law? Old Testament law, the biblical law, right? I think for a lot of us as Christians, the idea of the law is not a positive one. I know growing up in church, I was often given the sense that the law, well, that was for the Old Testament. That was sort of back when God was into works. That for Christians, we're not about law, we're about grace. Law is kind of bad, and grace is very good. And we don't do law, we do grace. And you're sort of left with this sense that God's law was not a great thing, not a good thing at all. But here's the thing. We have to remember that when the Bible uses the word law, all the word law means is covenant terms. That's what a law is in terms of the biblical context. When you talk about the law, you're talking about the terms of a particular covenant. So, for example, if I said to you, in my marriage with my wife Kelly, there's a law. We have a law, and we do. It's the terms or the vows of our covenant. I actually keep my covenant vows, my marriage vows, in the front of my Bible to Kelly. And I read them fairly regularly. I don't think of them as bad or oppressive or legalistic. And certainly Kelly doesn't think of them that way. She's glad that I know my vows to her. You see, law is not bad if it's used wisely. It's dangerous if it's not used wisely. There's a big difference between law and legalism. We'll come back to legalism in a minute. But see, read it. Here's another interesting chapter to read of the Bible sometime. Psalm 119, longest psalm in the Bible. And all it is a lengthy meditation on the beauty of God's law. It's not that law is wrong. It's that we can use the law wrongly if we're not careful. Here's the thing about law or marriage covenant terms. Covenant terms are good for this reason. They let covenant partners know how love will look, how it'll work in this particular covenant. You can't have a covenant if you don't have covenant law, covenant terms. You wouldn't know what to do. You wouldn't know how love operates in a particular covenant without the covenant terms or the covenant law. So law is good understood properly in covenantal context. But here's the thing about covenant laws. I think we see this pattern of God through Scripture. Covenant terms are good, but the fewer the better, and yet you need as many as necessary. Okay? Have as few as possible, but as many as necessary. I think that's a way of sort of describing the wisdom principle by which God works through his covenants. When it comes to the terms of a covenant, have as few as possible, but as many as necessary. And make sure that the terms of the covenant focus on the heart. This is a heart issue, heart attitude, right? So what one wants to do, if one is thinking wisely about a healthy covenant, one wants as few terms as possible that focus on how the people's hearts will be towards each other. Not so much on specific behaviors. Now here's the reason why. And Jesus really hits this point all through his ministry, particularly on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' point is this in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5. A number of times Jesus will quote an Old Testament law, and then he will say, but I say, so for example, he says, you've heard it say, do not commit murder, right? It's one of the 10 Commandments. Then Jesus says, but I say, do not be angry with your brother or sister. Do not call them a fool. Do not use abusive language towards them. In other words, Jesus takes the basic law of murder and puts it right at the heart level. Don't even act murderously or speak murderously or think murderously towards a brother or sister. In other words, you can be standing there smiling real nicely and have a heart of hatred towards your brother and sister. Jesus always takes the laws and puts it right at the heart. See, the problem is, if we make laws or covenant terms primarily about behaviors, well, people can do behaviors and still have hardened hearts towards their partner. But if your heart is oriented towards your partners, the behaviors naturally follow. Heart leads, behaviors follow. That's a principle that God uses and that we need to pay attention to in our covenants. So, this raises an interesting question about Mount Sinai. Let's rehearse God's pattern of covenant terms through the Bible. 6 major covenants, right? How many terms are in the Sinai or the creation covenant, the Noahic covenant with Noah, Abraham's covenant, the Sinai covenant, which we're looking at now, David's covenant, and finally the new covenant of Jesus Christ, our 6 main covenants? Well, in the creation covenant, just one term. Don't eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In Noah's covenant, actually there's no terms that humans are asked to hold to, not for the covenant. There's just 2 terms that God gives. A promise not to flood the earth, again, and a promise to keep the cycles of nature regular. When it comes to the Abrahamic covenant, no terms that Abraham has to keep. Just 4 promises God gives to Abraham. Descendants, land, great name, rest and blessing and protection. How about the Davidic covenant? Well, once again, nothing that David has to keep, just a promise from God. Actually, a series of promises from God about nation, rest and protection, and additional promise that David will always have a descendant on the throne. And as we'll see when we get to that covenant in a bit, that's the first central Old Testament promise of Messiah. And we'll see how that connects to Jesus. Finally, the new covenant, we'll be talking about this later, the covenant that Jesus brings into existence. There's only 2 terms that we're asked to hold to. Actually, it's really a 2-part single term. It's the love commandment, and it has 2 parts. Love God, love others. But it's really just the love commandment, 1 2-part term. So, what we have is in 5 of the covenants, either 1 term that humans are called to enact, or 2 to 3 terms that God's promising towards us. That's the pattern. And then we hit Mount Sinai. How many terms to the Mount Sinai covenant? Well, the traditional Jewish answer, the rabbinic Jewish answer to that question of how many laws in the Old Testament is this: 613. All right? This should stand out to us and cause us to say, wait a minute. Talk about a pattern interrupt here, right? 1 term, 2 terms for God, 4 terms for God, couple terms for God in Davidic covenant, 2 terms for us in the new covenant with Jesus, 613 terms for the Sinai covenant. What's going on? What's wrong with this picture? Well, I'll propose to you, here's a way to make sense out of why in this covenant God just overloads the Jewish people with covenant terms. So many of them it's hard to keep track. What do you do when you're in God's position of having promised Abraham that you'll make his descendants your people? So you are unconditionally bound to be in a relationship with these people, yet you know you can't trust these people. You've seen their hearts. Answer: enter into a conditional covenant with them, and then take 613 laws, terms of this covenant, and sort of fence them in with this amazing, immense number of laws. It's almost as if God is saying, I can't trust their hearts, because clearly their hearts aren't trustworthy. But what I can do is I can fence them in with a lot of behaviors that will keep them a distinct people for this season, while I need to keep them a nation. Promised Abraham I'd do that, until the point at which Messiah can arise and actually bring a change of heart to God's people. We'll keep them distinct in terms of their behavior in the world, but ultimately the goal is to have Messiah come and transform hearts by the very Spirit of God. I think this makes sense out of this unique covenant at Mount Sinai. Let's say a word about legalism, too, as long as we're talking about law. If law is simply a covenant term that helps express how love will work in a particular covenant, well, then what's legalism? Law is good, but legalism is bad. Well, legalism, here's the way I would define legalism. It's replacing the goal of law. Okay, law has a goal, and the goal is love relationship, keeping the covenant healthy. What legalism does is it steps away from the goal, which is healthy covenant relationship, and instead it focuses on the means to the goal, which is the law. See, in God's covenants, the focus isn't the law. The focus is the relationship. But the terms of the law are supposed to help love work itself out. In legalism, we get off the centrality of love and we move to the law as the point of it all. In other words, the behaviors become the point, not the relationship. That's the problem of legalism. This was the challenge that Jesus was constantly giving to the Pharisees, that they've lost the heart of the relationship with God because they're so focused on the minutia of the law itself. Law is to serve relationship, not replace it. Now see, if we move this idea of legalism into our modern context of marriage, we'd instantly see the problem with legalism. For example, if I took my wedding vows that I have spoken to Kelly, and I took them out of my Bible, the copy I have there, and let's say I was so concerned about keeping my marriage law, my marriage vows, that I went to a photocopier and I ran off 1,000 copies of my marriage vows, and I plastered them everywhere in my life. I had copies all over my car, my office at school, my home, my bathroom mirror, everywhere. I was so focused on the covenant terms that I forgot about Kelly, my wife. That would be legalism in my marriage. I'm forgetting the point of the terms is to lead to relationship with Kelly. And instead, I forget about Kelly and focus on the terms themselves. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. It's legalism. That can happen in covenants if we're not careful. If we're so focused on behaviors that we're not focused on the relationship that the behaviors are supposed to serve. Now, legalism's a problem for sure, but there's another equal problem on the other side of legalism. One could imagine two ditches we can fall into in a middle path between those ditches that we're supposed to be walking. So if one ditch is legalism, what's the other ditch? Well, Jesus calls this other ditch lawlessness. The first ditch, legalism, focuses so much on the law, it forgets the relationship. The second ditch, in fear of legalism, goes to the opposite extreme and forgets the law. And in the process of forgetting the law, it violates the relationship. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 that there is going to be people who on Judgment Day speak to him about how they did things for him. They cast out demons, they did miracles in his name. And it's interesting what Jesus says will be his words to some of these people. He'll say, "I never knew you, you who practiced lawlessness." So here's the thing. While the law cannot be our focus, because then we lose the relationship, neither can we forget the law and toss it away, lest, again, we lose the relationship. Relationship is this beautiful middle path between two ditches. And what's the middle path? Simply that of covenant love relationship, agape love. If we're actually loving our covenant partner, we won't fall into legalism, neither will we toss the law away and fall into lawlessness, but we'll walk that narrow path of covenant love. Love brings the balance to legalism and lawlessness.